So then, we're pretty much coming to the end of this tools section now. We've been through all of the different tools that we've got for building our rigs in Lightwave. We've seen how they work, all of their little idiosyncrasies, how they can fit together, how certain ones won't fit together, and so on. So what I want to do in the last stages of this section is to take a look at the most important tool of all, and that is the rig itself. We spoke about this back in the foundations section to some extent, looking at certain aspects of rig design and usage and seeing the rig from the point of view as an animation interface, an animation tool. Hopefully now, having seen all of the tools that we have in Lightwave to build these rigs out of, some of these ideas will start to crystallize a bit more and make an awful lot more sense as to the hows and whys things are certain ways, and also, of course, influence decisions about how and why we are going to build rigs in certain ways. As we've seen with plenty of the tools in Lightwave, many have their own little ways of working, or they have special ways that you have to set them up to get the correct results out. And of course, these tools have been designed to work in a certain way, to try and give the most efficient workflows and so on. When you are building a rig, similarly, you are building a tool. And to that end, you do need to invest time and thought and probably a good dose of experimentation into your rigs to find ways to build the best tools for a given task. Of course, this might vary quite a lot from either project to project or character to character, item to item, whatever it is you happen to be rigging. Different approaches might well be needed in different situations. There is, in truth, no one rig to rule them all. So here's one of the rigs that we'll look at in the project section. Nice simple biped setup here. We can see here just in the viewport that he's pretty light. He doesn't have an awful lot of control going on in him. But as we see, we've got the major control that we need for this specific character, which, as we've set him up here, is only really a basic thing. He's not intended to have lots of switching or functionality. He's meant to be quick and easy and accessible. IK legs, FK arms, simple little adjustments made for giving twist deformation and stuff like that. Notice as well here that this rig is using bones. You can also notice that the additional items I've put in, like for his pole vector, or the IK bases for his legs here, are also bone items. This is one thing that can be quite important when setting up a rig, is choosing whether to build rigs out of bones or out of objects, primarily nulls. What you cannot, of course, do in Lightwave is select both bones and objects at the same time, just like you can't select lights and cameras at the same time. These are different selection modes. As such, if you've got a character and say you've got some controls in the arm that are bones and other controls that are nulls, and the animator's just wanting to block select a bunch of them to key them together, or to, grab their keys in the track here to move them around, then you can't do it. He's got to select one lot of controls, do the adjustment, then select the other control type, do the adjustment. Making the controls that the animator interacts with all of the same type can often be the best way to go about building a rig, because it creates a tool for the animator which is much quicker and easier to use from a workflow point of view. There are, of course, mix-ups you can do. This is a quadruped rig again, which we will see, and quite obviously enough, he has all of these bones in him. However, all of his actual controls are on nulls. So even though he's got a load of bones in him, and indeed many of his bones do themselves have motion control, the IK for the legs here is set up entirely on the bones. What we do not have are any bone controls that you would grab and animate directly. Any bones that are controlled in some way always have their control coming from nulls. So this is something of a, null and bone rig that we have going on here. But the animation interface is based entirely upon nulls, even though some of the controls themselves are active upon bones. Obviously, most of what we have seen so far during the tools section here, I have used bones as the examples when doing IK, or constraints or various other things. The reason for that primarily has been illustration purposes. It's easier to see which way a bone is pointing than it is to see which way a null is pointing. You have this visual cue from the icon itself rather than having to look at the rotation handles. However, just because we have been doing it that way doesn't mean that's the way that it should be done. You can, of course, build entire control rig systems purely out of nulls, as we have in the case of this fellow here. All of his controls, his IK, absolutely everything, is done with nulls. He is a null-based rig, not a bone-based rig. Bones in this sense are only providing the deformation. All of the animation control is otherwise done with nulls. This, of course, allows you to use nice item shapes, which are great for animator to grab. They also provide nice visual clues about, what is what, and make a rig look quite nice and tidy. Of course, you might wonder, is it different making a nulls rig than a bones rig? We've seen so much in this section where we've used bones. No, not at all. As was mentioned way back in Foundations, an item is an item is an item. Any of the examples that we've done using bones could be done using nulls exactly the same way. They obey the same rules of pivot rotation, hierarchy, everything else. Making a rig out of nulls, exactly the same and just as easy as making one out of bones. What you'll also notice, doubtless, on this guy is that he's got an awful lot more controllers kicking around than the biped we saw a few moments ago, and he is indeed a far more complex rig. Lots of IKFK switching, all sorts of other fancy controllers going on here. And some may look at a rig of this level and think, wow, it's really quite heavy, it's confusing for an animator, this, that or the other. Of course, what all of these different parts represent are different systems. So these big cube items that we have at wrists here are purely for IK control. If you only ever wanted to animate the arms on IK, you could of course just take all of the FK stuff here and just hide it away. No need to see it. Immediately the rig starts to look a bit simpler and a bit lighter. Similarly, if you're animating here on FK, then there's no reason at all you can't go getting rid of all of the IK stuff there for visual simplicity. Of course, it may often be tempting to build simpler rigs much of the time. I need a character to do so, and so I'll just build a nice, quick, simple rig. One of the beauties of the more complex rigging like this is that it allows the animator to sort of work however he or she wishes to work. If they desire IK control, they can throw things into IK and just forget about the FK. Or, of course, vice versa. It also, of course, helps you out when you are in the process of an animation. There's nothing worse than getting to a certain point in an animation, realizing that your rig needs a certain kind of control to pull off a particular move, and not having it. Trying to go back and re-rig stuff ad hoc as the needs arise can be quite a minefield. If it's something like your character's only got FK arms and you want to go back and add in IK, that can usually be pretty simple and you can get away with that because of course the main structure of the arm doesn't need to change. You're just adding a new control method. But if you wind up with things where you needed to build in extra hierarchical components, be that offsets or whatever else somewhere into it, as we've seen along the way you sometimes need to do, that would cause you a problem because of course all of the animation that you've done isn't done on the correct hierarchy and there's going to probably be a lot of fixing. This brings us to the other point of simpler rigging versus more complex rigging. And that's the fact that the rig has to be able to do whatever the performance requires. Again, you are building a tool. You are building an animation tool. You should always take a good appraisal of what the character needs to do or the rig needs to do, what the animation needs to contain, the kinds of movements that are going to be desired, and build a rig that satisfies all of these needs. If you don't, then you'll either wind up with, massive problems during animation where things have to be changed, or you'll wind up with things that can't be achieved properly and your animation will suffer as a result of that. Building a tool that is fit for purpose is the cardinal rule. So here's a good example that demonstrates some of these points. We've got this character and we've got his arms in IK mode and we imagine that he's, resting his hands on a countertop or something, yeah? What I'll do is I'll grab his spine here and I'll start turning it from side to side like this. Now, of course, his hands stay locked in place, But you see what's happening to the elbows. They are waving in and out because the twist or the roll of the arm is inheriting itself from the character's body. That is to say that we have this, FK style controller here at the shoulder point that determines the roll of the IK plane. And since that is a direct child of the body, you get this what is called character space point direction for the elbow. We do, however, have pole vectors set up for this guy, so if we key those off in place and then turn both of them on and have a look at what we get this time when we roll his body, we see that we get something different. See, the body rolls, but the point of the elbow, the direction in which they're aiming, stays the same. The roll of each arm is obviously changing because the body is rolling, and so the arms are counter-rolling against it, maintaining the same direction in space. Have a try of this for yourself if you're, stood at a bar or a kitchen table or something talking to people when you've got your arms rested. You will find that a lot of the time this is how we tend to move. We tend to keep our elbows in that sort of situation oriented into a single direction. Whereas when we're doing a push-up or something else, we tend to roll our arms as we go up and down with our body. That's more of a character space elbow movement. Of course, we also have a third space that the poles can go to, and that would be what if they were children, effectively, of the IK goals themselves. So what I have here is a little pole pin null, and I can switch to constrain my pole item to that. In this case, moving from the body, we seem to have pretty much the same sort of effect going on there, but that's because my goal null here for the wrist is unmoving. As such, the pole now goes with the rotation of the goal here. And of course, if you had him driving a car with his hand going round the wheel, then his arm here would be able to orbit around as his hand turned in response to, as it went round the wheel and stuff like that. So you get this kind of action going on where you get what is basically a goal space aim direction for the elbow. What this all represents is different ways of automatically creating certain types of motion. If you're trying to animate a character stood at a desk or something and he's turning left and turning right, and you're wanting his elbow to more or less orient in a constant direction, and you don't have a pole vector set up, then the animator can do that, but he has to counter animate the upper arm against the movement of the body. As such, when you're adjusting timing or when you're, changing the curves on your keyframes to slow in and slow out, you've got to make all of the same adjustments over to the roll controller of the arm. This is more work, it takes more time. If, however, you have the pole vector system available, then that can keep the elbow locked in a constant direction, meaning that you never have to counter animate all of that stuff. The rig does it for you. Of course, you can get into the inverse situation where you have the pole vector but no means to switch it off. And in a case like that, then again, you're having to do a lot of additional animation to give the wave of the elbow as a character moves around. So these are the considerations that you have to take into account, really down to these fine specific details. What sort of controller system is needed to make the lightest work of that animation, and so on. And very often that is why we end up with what appear to be quite complex heavy rigs where there's lots of switching, where you can switch this and switch that and this into FK and pole can follow this or not follow that. And sometimes such rigs seem a little daunting, but really they are much faster to operate with, because often in a given shot the character needs to behave a specific way. And so rather than having different rigs that represent different kinds of motion, very often what will happen is the animator will start a shot, set all of these switches and locks exactly the way that they're needed for the performance of that specific motion in that specific shot, and then you can forget about them. It's not something that you're constantly having to switch back, switch on, switch off, although again that does depend upon the animation being done. If you have got a situation where he needs to be able to do this move in IK, do the next move in FK, then of course having switching makes that far easier and is a lot less work than all of the additional counter animation that you need if you've only got one system in place. Of course, all that said, you do have to take a good appraisal of the actual object or character itself. Here's our little lamp, who we're also going to see in the project section. And he's incredibly versatile. Look, he's got this wonderful little, IK system for doing all of this, and he's got this head system here, and he's got his wonderful little tip flap that he can do here, and he can even roll around like this. He's incredibly posable, incredibly maneuverable. Every possible little movement that this character could wish to perform, given his anatomy, is provided for. And yet look at what we've got. 4 controllers. That's it. We could easily have done this in FK with a controller for this bit, a controller for that bit, a controller for the next bit. We could have done this a number of ways, such as putting controllers in here for the whole bracket system, one to do this bit, another one to do that bit. We might have looked at his head and seen that, of course, it pivots up and down one way, but it also swings around, on this level here. We might have thrown in 2 controllers, one to manipulate it one way, one to do it the other, etc. It's easy to sort of overload your controls a bit. Having a good view of exactly what actions need to be performed and in combination with which others will aid you in designing controller setups that can be much lighter. Again, we can see the kind of feet system that can often be good to use, as we have here with the reverse foot system for our IK legs. The feet, of course, can, tip and pivot and do all sorts of things from all sorts of places. You've got all these different little actions that a foot can perform. But by observing how they do or do not overlap in certain circumstances, what we're able to do with this guy is to take all of those different controls and pack them down onto a single one controller that we have here. And this lets us do all of this great stuff just off of one single control, rather than having all these different little pivot points of IK controls scattered around all over the foot, which again would be more management, more keyframes to keep track of, and so on. And of course, what we also want to do is be careful in watching the rules of things and how they behave when it comes to sorting out the alignments and orientations of things. We've spoken in the various examples about trying to get this thing on a certain axis so the action happens a certain way, to get around gimbal lock or to get around Euler flips or whatever else. This idea of looking at joints on a setup to see which are the major axis of transformation. Of course, we gave way back in Foundations the example of the shoulder, which, having its heading as the up-down, leaves us with the pitch to do forward-back, irrespective of the up-down pose. The hand or wrist here is another good example. Notice how I've got the up-down flappy action of the hand here on the heading. Now that is the direction that the wrist can turn that has by far the greatest degree of mobility. You don't have as much side-to-side motion, not by a long shot. Also, of course, you do have twist on a hand or forearm. However, notice what happens if your hand is, say, completely up like this at 90 degrees or completely down at 90 degrees. You've still got the hand side-to-side tipping action, but notice, on account of the fact that I've used heading, when I come down at 90 degrees, it is my pitch that is now aligned with the twist, but it's still going side to side in terms of the hand itself. But look at your own hand if you put it into this pose. You can't move it side to side. All you can do is twist and untwist your forearm. As such, this alignment on the wrist controller mirrors exactly what a real wrist would do. And what a real wrist essentially does is sort of gimbal lock. Once it comes at 90 degrees, the side-to-side action cannot be done anymore, and all you have is the twisting action of the forearm. So being methodical in choosing the orientations of things will also pay off big dividends in the long run. I'm sure you've probably guessed that I could waffle on for hours and hours and hours here and have example after example after example of this thing on this character, this thing on that setting, and so on. I'm not going to, because, as I said, it would take hours and hours, and I still wouldn't be able to cover every possible example. Whilst there are certain commonalities, like we see here, shoulder, hand, foot, whatever, that occur time and time and time again on project after project, you can, of course, just take the known methods that work well and apply them time after time after time. However, you will, of course, if you come across projects that may be a little more different, you may well find yourself having to think for yourself and try and experiment with these. And so I do encourage you, as much as you can, even when you are starting out with what appear to be known systems, to maybe try and fiddle things up a bit. See what you discover. Appraise things in terms of the motions that you get out and the animation workflow that is created by a certain orientation or a certain controller setup or a certain control availability. Of course, if you find this a little bit bewildering still at this stage, don't worry. As we do go through the practical projects section, we will see many examples of setting things up in different ways, and we'll see how things can be free in some instances to work in slightly different ways, and how much of the time there isn't only one fixed way that you have to do things. So stay tuned, keep your eyes peeled, and I promise we'll see plenty of examples of working through stuff like this as we move forward.